May 19, 1962. Marilyn Monroe stood backstage at Madison Square Garden, unable to move, not because she was nervous, though she was, not because 15,000 people were waiting for her, though they were, but because she literally could not move. The dress she was wearing was so tight that it had been sewn directly onto her naked body, thread by thread, stitch by stitch. For the past 3 hours, she had stood perfectly still while seamstresses worked on her like she was a mannequin instead of a human being. She couldn't sit, couldn't eat, couldn't even use the bathroom. And now, in 30 minutes, she would have to walk out on that stage and sing Happy Birthday to the President of the United States while wearing a dress that was so tight she could barely breathe. This was the price of being Marilyn Monroe. This was what it took to create an iconic moment. And what happened in the next hour would become the most famous performance of her entire career, but almost nobody would know what it cost her. This is the untold story of the dress that was sewn onto Marilyn Monroe's body, and the 3 hours of agony that created 60 seconds of perfection. The dress itself was a work of art and an instrument of torture. Designer Jean-Louis had created it specifically for this moment. It was made of sheer nude fabric covered with 2,500 hand-sewn crystals. From a distance, it looked like Marilyn was wearing diamonds. Up close, it looked like she was wearing nothing at all. The fabric was so sheer you could see through it, so tight that it clung to every curve of her body like a second skin. But the dress had one major problem. It was physically impossible to put on. The fabric had no stretch. None. The zipper was purely decorative. The dress had been constructed to fit Marilyn's exact measurements down to the millimeter, but those measurements assumed she would be standing perfectly still. Any movement, any bend, any breath that was too deep, and the seams would strain or the fabric would tear. Jean-Louis had explained this to Marilyn 3 days before the performance. "You won't be able to step into it," he said. "You'll have to be sewn into it while standing. It will take several hours, and once you're in it, you won't be able to move normally until we cut you out of it." "How long will I have to wear it?" Marilyn asked. "From the time we finish sewing until after your performance. Probably 4 or 5 hours total." "I can't use the bathroom for 5 hours?" Jean-Louis shook his head. "Not without cutting the dress off and starting over, which we won't have time to do, so you'll need to plan accordingly." Marilyn looked at the dress hanging on its form. It was breathtaking. It was going to photograph beautifully. It was going to make headlines around the world, but it was also going to be the most uncomfortable thing she had ever worn in her life. "Okay," Marilyn said finally. "Let's do it." But she didn't realize just how bad it was going to be until the day of the performance. Marilyn arrived at Madison Square Garden at 4:00 p.m. The performance wasn't scheduled to start until 8:00 p.m., but Jean-Louis had told her she needed to arrive early, very early, because getting her into the dress was going to be a production in itself. Jean-Louis had set up a private dressing room backstage. When Marilyn walked in, she saw that he had brought 3 seamstresses with him. They had needles, thread, scissors, and serious expressions on their faces. "Are you ready?" Jean-Louis asked. Marilyn nodded. She had followed his instructions precisely. She hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. She had used the bathroom 3 times in the last hour, making sure she wouldn't need to go again for a long time. She had done her hair and makeup before arriving because she wouldn't be able to sit in a chair once the dress was on. "All right," Jean-Louis said. "You'll need to remove everything you're wearing. Everything. The dress is so sheer that anything underneath will show." Marilyn had known this was coming, but it was still strange to undress in front of 4 strangers. She took off her robe and stood there completely naked while Jean-Louis and his team prepared the dress. "Step into the center of the room," Jean-Louis directed. "Stand with your feet shoulder-width apart, arms slightly away from your body, and don't move. This is the position you'll need to hold for the next 3 hours. 3 hours. Standing perfectly still, naked, while 4 people worked on her body." Marilyn took her position. The seamstresses brought the dress over and carefully, delicately began positioning it on her body. It wasn't really being put on. It was being constructed around her. The fabric was draped and pinned and adjusted and readjusted. Jean-Louis circled her like a sculptor studying a statue, making tiny adjustments, demanding perfection. Then the sewing began. The seamstresses worked from the bottom up. Starting at Marilyn's ankles, they began stitching the fabric directly to itself, with Marilyn's body inside. The stitches were tiny, invisible, perfect, but there were so many of them. Hundreds, maybe thousands, and each one took time. The first hour wasn't too bad. Marilyn's legs didn't hurt yet. She could still distract herself by talking to Jean Louis about the performance, about what she would say when she walked on stage, about how President Kennedy would react. But then her legs started to hurt. Standing perfectly still isn't natural for the human body. We're designed to move, to shift our weight, to adjust our position. But Marilyn couldn't do any of that. Every time she tried to shift even slightly, Jean Louis would say, "Still, please. We need you completely still." Her feet started to ache, then her calves, then her thighs. She could feel the muscles in her legs beginning to cramp, but she couldn't stretch them. She couldn't sit down. She couldn't even bend her knees slightly to relieve the pressure. "How much longer?" Marilyn asked after what felt like forever. "We're halfway done," Jean Louis said. "Another 90 minutes. Marilyn closed her eyes and tried to think about something else, anything else. But all she could think about was the pain in her legs and the fact that she still had an hour and a half of standing perfectly still ahead of her. The seamstresses moved up her body, hips, waist, ribs. Every inch of the dress had to be sewn with precision. As they got closer to her chest, Marilyn realized another problem. "I can't breathe deeply," she said. "You'll need to take shallow breaths," Jean Louis said. "The dress is designed to fit when you're breathing normally. If you take a deep breath, the seams might pop." So now Marilyn had to stand perfectly still with aching legs and take only shallow breaths. She could feel panic starting to rise in her chest. What if she couldn't do this? What if she passed out? What if the dress ripped while she was on stage in front of the president and 15,000 people? "I need to sit down," Marilyn said suddenly. "Just for a minute, please." "I'm sorry," Jean Louis said, and he did sound genuinely sorry. "If you sit, the dress will wrinkle and the seams will strain. We'd have to start over. And we don't have time for that." Marilyn felt tears starting to form in her eyes, but she couldn't even wipe them away because moving her arms might disturb the seamstresses who were working on the top of the dress. So she just stood there, tears running down her face while 4 people sewed her into what was essentially a crystal cage. "Tell me something," Marilyn said to Jean Louis, needing the distraction. "Why did you make the dress this tight? Why couldn't it have a little bit of stretch?" Jean Louis paused his work and looked at her seriously. "Because you asked me to create something that would stop the world. You said you wanted people to remember this moment forever. A comfortable dress isn't memorable. A dress that looks like it's painted onto your body? That's memorable. That's iconic. That's what you asked for." He was right. Marilyn had told him she wanted something that had never been seen before. Something that would make every photograph from this night look like a work of art. Something that would make people talk for decades. Well, she was getting exactly what she asked for, and it hurt. Finally, after 3 hours and 10 minutes of standing perfectly still, the last stitch was made. Marilyn was sealed inside the dress. Jean Louis stepped back to examine his work. "Perfect," he said. "Absolutely perfect. You look like a goddess." Marilyn tried to walk. It was like learning to move all over again. The dress allowed her to take small steps, but nothing more. She couldn't sit, couldn't bend at the waist, could barely lift her arms above her elbows. Moving felt like being wrapped in the world's most expensive and uncomfortable mummy costume. "How do I walk in this?" Marilyn asked. "Very carefully," Jean Louis said. "Small steps. Don't try to walk normally. Glide, like you're floating." Marilyn practiced moving around the dressing room. Each step had to be calculated. The fabric was so tight around her thighs that she had to move her legs from the hips, keeping her knees fairly straight. It created a distinctive walk, sexy, but also strange, like she was moving in slow motion. "What time is it?" Marilyn asked. 7:15, Jean Louis said. "You go on at 8:30. Another hour and 15 minutes in this dress." Marilyn wasn't sure she could make it. Her legs were screaming. Her breathing was shallow. The crystals on the dress were heavy and pulled at the fabric, which pulled at her skin. She was starting to feel dizzy. "I need water," Marilyn said. "I'll get it," one of the seamstresses said. She brought back a glass with a straw. Marilyn tried to drink, but even the act of swallowing was complicated by the tightness of the dress around her ribs. She could only take small sips. But then something happened that made all the pain worthwhile. There was a knock on the dressing room door. "Miss Monroe," a voice called. "5-minute warning, and the president wanted me to tell you he's looking forward to your performance." The president, John F. Kennedy. The most powerful man in the world was sitting in Madison Square Garden, waiting for Marilyn Monroe to sing to him. In that moment, despite all the pain and discomfort, Marilyn felt a surge of excitement. This was why she did it. This was why she endured the pain and the pressure and the uncomfortable dresses and all of it. Because she got to create moments like this. Moments that mattered. Moments that would be remembered. "Tell the president I'll see him soon," Marilyn said. She took one last look at herself in the mirror. Jean-Louis was right. The dress was spectacular. It caught the light from every angle. The crystals sparkled like stars, and the sheer fabric created an illusion that was both innocent and incredibly sexy at the same time. She looked like she was wearing diamonds and air. "It's time," Jean-Louis said. Marilyn took a shallow breath and began the long, slow walk from her dressing room to the stage. Each step was calculated. Each movement controlled. She could feel the dress straining with every step, feel the seams pulling against the stitches. If any of them popped, the whole dress might come apart. She made it to the wings of the stage. She could hear the crowd, 15,000 people, and somewhere in that crowd, President Kennedy and his wife Jackie and dozens of other famous people, all waiting for her. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, the late Marilyn Monroe." It was a joke. Marilyn was notoriously late to everything. The audience laughed, but Marilyn didn't think it was funny. She was terrified. Terrified the dress would rip. Terrified she would trip. Terrified she would forget the words. Terrified she would pass out from not being able to breathe properly. But then the spotlight hit her and all the fear disappeared, because this was what she did. This was who she was, Marilyn Monroe. The biggest star in the world, and she knew how to own a stage. She began her walk, that slow, gliding, almost floating walk that the dress forced her into, and the audience went silent, completely silent. You could hear the collective intake of breath as 15,000 people saw her at once. She looked exactly like she was supposed to look, like a dream, like a fantasy, like something too beautiful and too perfect to be real. When she reached the microphone, she paused, let the moment breathe, let everyone absorb what they were seeing. Then she leaned into the microphone and began to sing. "Happy birthday to you." Her voice was breathy, sexy, intimate, like she was singing to one person instead of thousands, like this was a private moment between her and the president, and everyone else was just lucky enough to witness it. "Happy birthday to you." The dress sparkled under the lights. Every movement caught the crystals and sent light dancing across the stage. Even though she could barely move, that limitation actually made the performance more powerful. She wasn't dancing or gesturing wildly. She was simply standing there, draped in crystals, singing in that voice that made every man in the room forget they had a wife sitting next to them. "Happy birthday, Mr. President." She drew out the last line, making it almost a question, making it flirtatious, making it mean something more than just a birthday song. The audience erupted in applause and laughter and whistles. Marilyn smiled. She had done it. Despite the pain and the dress and the shallow breathing and the 3 hours of standing still, she had done it. She had created a moment that would live forever. After the performance, Marilyn was escorted backstage quickly. She needed to get out of the dress before she collapsed. Jean-Louis was waiting with his scissors. "Hold still," he said. "I have to cut you out." He began cutting the stitches one by one. It took another 30 minutes to free Marilyn from the dress. When the last stitch was cut and the dress fell away, Marilyn almost collapsed. Her legs were shaking. Her body was covered in red marks where the fabric had pressed into her skin. She had been in that dress for nearly 5 hours. "Are you okay?" Jean-Louis asked, concerned. Marilyn took her first deep breath in hours. "I'm fine," she said. "It was worth it." And it was worth it. The performance made headlines around the world. The photographs from that night became some of the most iconic images of Marilyn Monroe ever taken. That dress, that song, that moment became a permanent part of American history. But almost nobody knew what it had cost her. Almost nobody knew about the 3 hours of standing perfectly still while being sewn into the dress. About the pain in her legs and the shallow breathing and the tears running down her face while seamstresses worked on her body. About the hour of walking in a dress so tight she could barely move. Years later, that dress would sell at auction for $4.8 million, the most expensive dress ever sold. But Jean-Louis would say in an interview, "The dress wasn't the achievement. The achievement was Marilyn wearing it. Most women couldn't have endured what she endured to create that moment. The performance at Madison Square Garden was May 19, 1962. Less than 3 months later, Marilyn would be dead. That performance would become her last major public appearance. The last time the world would see Marilyn Monroe at her most glamorous, her most iconic, her most perfectly herself. And every time someone sees the photographs or video from that night, they see the goddess, the fantasy, the impossible beauty in the impossible dress, but they don't see the human woman who stood for 3 hours being sewn into that dress, who cried from the pain, who couldn't breathe properly, who risked everything to create 60 seconds of perfection. That's the thing about iconic moments. We see the result, not the cost. We see the performance, not the pain. We see Marilyn Monroe in that crystal dress, but we don't see the 3 hours of standing perfectly still, the shallow breaths, the aching legs, the tears, but maybe that's exactly how Marilyn wanted it. Maybe the pain was the point. Maybe she understood that creating something unforgettable requires sacrifice, requires suffering, requires being willing to literally have a dress sewn onto your naked body and endure hours of agony just to create one perfect moment, because that moment was perfect. That dress was perfect. That performance was perfect. And 60 years later, people still remember it, still talk about it, still marvel at it. Marilyn Monroe standing on that stage in a dress made of crystals and air, singing Happy Birthday to the President of the United States is one of the most famous images in American history. It's been referenced and parodied and recreated thousands of times. It's been analyzed by historians and fashion experts and psychologists. It's been called everything from the height of glamour to the beginning of the end, but it was really just a woman in a very uncomfortable dress, doing her job, creating magic, paying the price that nobody sees. Jean-Louis kept one of the crystals from the dress. After Marilyn died, he would take it out sometimes and hold it, remembering that day, remembering how brave she had been, how professional, how willing to endure pain for her art. People think being Marilyn Monroe was easy, Jean-Louis said in his final interview before his own death. They think it was all glamour and beauty and men falling at her feet, but they didn't see what I saw. They didn't see her standing naked in a dressing room for 3 hours while we sewed a dress onto her body, standing perfectly still even though her legs were cramping, taking shallow breaths even though she wanted to breathe deep, crying silently because it hurt so much. That's who Marilyn Monroe really was. Someone willing to endure anything to create something beautiful. Someone willing to sacrifice her comfort, her health, her body just to give the world one perfect moment. And that's what she gave us. One perfect moment, sewn together with thread and pain and determination and the unwavering belief that beauty is worth suffering for. If this story showed you a side of Marilyn you never knew existed, subscribe for more untold stories about the real cost of fame. Hit that like button if you believe in the people who sacrifice everything to create moments of beauty. And tell us in the comments, did you know about the dress being sewn onto her body? Would you endure that kind of pain for 60 seconds of perfection? Sometimes the most beautiful moments are created by the most painful processes. Sometimes perfection requires suffering, and sometimes the price of being iconic is 3 hours of standing perfectly still while people sew crystals onto your naked body. That was the price Marilyn Monroe paid, and she paid it willingly, because she understood something most of us forget. Nothing worth remembering comes easy.